A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 21. Allie thought something was wrong with the young animal keeper. For one thing, he was covered with sweat. So much it dripped from his chin. For another, he was breathing too hard, yet he smiled at her, a strange smile that showed his lower teeth as well as his upper teeth. With the copper-tipped prod in his right hand, he walked toward her, his left hand stretched out at his side, as if he expected her to run and was ready to catch her. He had left the door of her cage open. She sat quietly in the corner and looked up at him. Suddenly, quickly, he jabbed the prod against her wrist. She did not cry out, since the doctor had told her she could not, nor did she hurt, since the doctor had told her she would not. But her arm felt funny. It tingled and jerked back. She did not move it. It moved itself. Then the tinkling stopped, and she sat still as before. In the quick motion, her sleeve had brushed the cage wall and lost its remaining button, and her shirt cuff hung loosely from her forearm. The young keeper stared, the sweat dripping down his face faster than before. In his own cage, in the farthest corner, Victor whimpered. The prod came at her again, this time harder than before, so that its metal end left a red mark on her arm. Once more the tinkling came, and her hand flew back of its own accord. She sat quietly. The young keeper's smile disappeared. He said something in the language she could not understand. Still it sounded ugly, and though he spoke in a low voice, it was angry, like an animal growling. In his cage, Victor stopped whimpering and also made a noise like a growl. She had never heard Victor make that noise before. Unexpectedly, the keeper's left hand lashed out and caught one leg of her slacks near the ankle. He pulled hard and the cloth ripped, exposing the bare skin of her calf and shin. He gripped her ankle tightly and then rammed the end of the prod hard into the calf. As her arm had done, the leg jerked, its muscles cramped, and straining against his grip. It had nothing to do with her. The leg pulled itself back, then kicked, then pulled again, taking him off balance. He fell forward, crashing his face against the cage wall, dropping the prod with a noisy clatter. He remained motionless for a minute, lying partly on top of Allie. Then he sat up and shook his head. She saw that he had turned shiny red. He looked at her and raised his hand. He was angry. He was going to hit her in the face. Suddenly, he turned and looked at the door of the laboratory. He had heard something, or thought he had. Very quickly, he picked up the prod, left the cage, put the prod in its customary place against the wall in the corner. His hands were shaking so that he had trouble locking her cage door. He disappeared into the inner room of the laboratory. When he came out a few minutes later, he had stopped shaking and went out by the door that led up the stairs. Victor left his corner and came to the cage wall on her side, staring at her sadly. Allie fell asleep almost immediately without getting up, and in her sleep she moaned and wept. After his telephone call had been completed, Kublet summoned Dr. Schutz for a conference. Actually, it had turned into a series of telephone calls. He had been shunted from one skeptical official to another, each one guarded by a cautious male secretary, each one available only after a protracted wait. So frustratingly was the afternoon passed. Still, something had been achieved, and Schutz must be notified. When the doctor arrived, Kublet gestured him to the chair and began abruptly. The possibility that there has been a security failure is only a possibility. I do not myself believe it, but precautions will be taken even so. Also, I think it is now essential that we conclude the research quickly. I am already at work on the final report, said Dr. Schutz. As I have informed you, I will need the earlier reports for reference in preparing it. They are in this safe, Kublet said. I remind you again of their classification. They must be kept locked in the laboratory until they can be returned to me. Naturally, Dr. Schultz said rather warily, as has been done each time in the past. You will have them back in 3 days, 4 at the most. The work will then be finalized. All has gone satisfactorily until the present, Kublet said. He emphasized the next words. But the battle is not won until it is ended. There must be no slip. You refer to the tree, but it has been removed. Not the tree. He recounted briefly what Nikolai had reported. Nikolai is an old lady peering through the window curtains, said Dr. Schutz. Every man who passes is a robber. Perhaps. Kublitz privately was inclined to agree. Yet the wall is not so easily scaled, and the dock does not conceal instruments we wish to. And the dock does conceal instruments we do not wish examined. Does the intruder also carry microscopes and petri dishes? They could scarcely learn much otherwise. Kublitz ignored the sarcasm. This afternoon, Nikolai is, on my instructions, installing a simple electrical alarm system inside the fence that surrounds the laboratory. It is merely a fine wire antenna connected to a small transmitter, battery-powered, that we will place in the laboratory. Should an intruder trip the wire, it will sound an alarm, a very quiet one, in this receiver. Kublitz took from his desk drawer a cylinder resembling a thick fountain pen. For the next 30 hours, I will keep the receiver with me. He paused and replaced the box in his desk. After that, he added, we will have 2 additional security guards assigned to the zoo area. Because they must fly from Moscow, they cannot arrive sooner. Since it is only for a few days, the ambassador has agreed to the increased staff. After that, we have assured him we will dismantle our equipment and move out. Meanwhile, he has insisted that their presence here be as unobtrusive as possible. They will not come directly from the airport in the back of a paneled. They will come directly from the airport in the back of a paneled truck. They will set up quarters in the zoo equipment building. For laboratory facilities, they will use the bathroom in your laboratory. They will, of course, be given keys to the laboratory. Kublitz noticed that Dr. Schutz was sitting very still, his face rigidly composed as if he were holding his breath. I trust these arrangements will not interfere with the completion of your work. There will, of course, be a concealed switch at the gate so that you and Georg Walter may turn off the transmitter when you enter the laboratory. I will come myself later today to inspect Nikolai's installation. I will at that time bring with me the file containing your reports until the alarm is installed. I would prefer that they remain here. As Georg Walter left the laboratory and locked the door behind him, the red haze that had clouded his mind and his eyes was disappearing, and he was able to think. It was raining, and the water cooled his face. There was, after all, no one near the door. The noise had been imaginary, or perhaps the gusty wind. He could have continued. Yet the girl's response had not been satisfactory. He knew that the electric shock emitted by the cattle prod was extremely painful, but her reaction had been merely reflexive. It was obvious that she was not feeling anything at all. She had made no outcry, not even a whimper, and there were none of the facial contortions that it was his particular pleasure to watch. What had they called it at the hospital in Frankfurt? Visual masochistic transference. Psychiatrists were clever at using long words to describe simple joys, but not clever enough to keep him locked up after he had been caught. Why? What kind of hypnosis had Schutz used? It was unfortunate that he knew no English and could not talk to the girl. Thus, there was no question of counter-hypnosis. Schutz had said he had given her the diphenol injection series, but he, Georg, himself a biologist, did not believe it. They were simply not that effective. No, Schutz had found something better. In fact, he had the feeling for some time that Schutz was up to something that had nothing to do with their work on Anthraxis. As Georg walked back toward the villa, he thought about the girl. When he had first entered her cage, she had been asleep, and he recalled now that she had been making a noise, a painful distress sound halfway between a sigh and a moan. Also, when she awoke as he opened the cage, in that first instant, there had been fear in her eyes, he was sure of it. Then, as she came fully awake, it vanished, and from then on her calm expression never wavered. He had an idea. Suppose the hypnosis, whatever it was effective only while she was awake. He had read of such cases, psychiatric patients who could be kept calm while awake, but whose terror and agony returned so violently during sleep that they had to be kept bound. It should be easy to test. The girl slept much of the time. He had only to approach quietly and apply the prod before she woke up. If it produced the desired effect, well, there were injections in the laboratory he could use to keep her alive. Or perhaps half asleep would be sufficient. It was, in fact, a brilliant idea. His disappointment diminished. A sense of anticipation returned. As he approached the villa, he met Schutz walking fast in the opposite direction. The doctor was greatly agitated. A dangerous situation has come up, he said. We must return to the laboratory immediately. Georg was alarmed. Could Schutz know something? Did he suspect? I have just left the laboratory. He kept his voice even. Everything is in order. The idiot Nikolai has caused trouble. He has reported intruders spying on the laboratory. I have just seen Kublitz. Intruders? Then? How could it be? Twice, at dawn. But the laboratory is locked, and it is underground. What could they see? Also, a fisherman has approached the dock. What does that mean? Nothing. It is idiocy. I told Kublitz, but it is no use. He and Nikolai are coming to install an alarm system. So, Georg was relieved. It was, after all, not what he had feared. He shrugged. Let them. It can do no harm. They are coming into the laboratory. The girl is there. We must get her out. He had not thought of that. Of course, the girl's presence was unknown to Kublitz and Nikolai, and must remain unknown. What will we do? Surely you will not dispose of her. We have yet had no time to make tests on her. I think it will not be necessary. I will hide her temporarily. Then we will see. Hide her where? There is no place. I will take her to a place in the woods. When Nikolai and Kublitz have left, I will bring her back. With luck, it will be only a brief inconvenience. They walked briskly through the rain back toward the laboratory. Fortunately, the weather is bad, observed the doctor. There will be no visitors at the zoo. In the laboratory, all was quiet. The large chimpanzee was in his cage, the girl in hers, and there was no sign of Nikolai. Dr. Schutz's near panic subsided. When Kublitz had told him of the new precautions, the transmitter, the wire, the security guards, he had felt the pulse begin to hammer in his head. He had felt dizzy for a moment, as if he might fall from the chair. He had seen his plan collapsing before him, a bridge of glass shattered by a hammer blow. The first alarm and the worst had been over the reports. He had thought Kublitz was refusing to release them. He must have the reports. They contained all of his data, so toilsomely accumulated, so carefully concealed. But at the end, Kublitz had agreed to bring them to the laboratory. The second consternation had been over the girl. He walked now to her cage and opened it. She sat up, awakening slowly. She looked pale. One of her trouser legs had somehow got torn. One of her shirt sleeves hung loose, its cuff unbuttoned. No matter at the moment. He would get pins to fix them later. He remembered the rain and, entering the inner laboratory, brought out the blue coat. Georg was on his instructions, counting cultural densities under the microscope and noting them in a ledger. The objective was to appear busy and normal. If the others come, tell them I will return in a few minutes, he told Georg. You need not be specific. The girl put the coat on and buttoned it. Taking her by the hand, he led her quickly through the door and away from the laboratory into the woods, toward the big iron gate, in the opposite direction of the villa. He looked for a suitable spot. 100 yards into the woods, 100 feet back from the wall, he found it. A large oak grew close to an even larger beech tree, their branches intertwining in an arch overhead, their heavy boles only a few feet apart. Near them a young pine spread, its limbs close to the ground. The center of the triangle thus formed was well hidden, and overhead branches would even provide some shelter from the slow rain. He seated the girl so that she could rest against the smooth bark of the beech tree. He talked to her briefly in a low voice, then he walked back to the laboratory. The girl would remain seated, motionless and silent, until he returned. She would enjoy sitting in the nice fresh air in the pretty woods. As he walked, he reviewed his personal timetable. At first, he had thought, disaster. Kublitz had wrecked it completely. Now he saw that it made no real difference. He had planned to leave before dawn on Friday, 3 days from today, but in 30 hours, Kublitz said, 2 security guards would arrive. Taking turns with Nikolai, they would keep the laboratory under 24-hour surveillance until the work was complete. The final report turned in. They would be armed. Obviously, one could not leave at dawn, accompanied by a non-existent girl carrying a bulky top-secret portfolio under the eyes of an armed KGB guard. But as soon as the dizzying effect of this pronouncement had worn off, the solution had become clear. It required only a slight change, a small bit of haste. He would leave instead at dawn tomorrow. Perhaps it was even for the better. The girl looked not really ill, but pale. It would be well to get her away out of the cage into more civilized quarters, provided with a better diet. Already she had lost 7 pounds. Not dangerous, but not good. Also, leaving Wednesday instead of Friday would avoid possible complications for a weekend when people could be difficult to locate and air traffic crowded. At dawn tomorrow, then. No. The memory came with the shock of a blow. It had been at dawn. Kublitz had said clearly twice, at dawn, that Nikolai claimed a prowler had been seen near the zoo. From where would Nikolai watch? Probably from his room in the villa, which was high in the attic. Very likely he had a glass, a telescope, or binocular. No matter, having achieved his small sensation, he could wager Nikolai would be watching. Not at dawn, then. At midnight, in the dark. It would mean a few hours of waiting outside after they left the laboratory, but the rain seemed to be subsiding, and in any case, they would survive. The road leading to the highway seemed to be well wooded on both sides. They would walk out the gate, up the hill, up the road until they were near the bus rendezvous, find a secluded spot, and wait for daylight. He wondered how early the buses began, surely by 7. As he approached the wire fence surrounding the laboratory, he saw Nikolai at work, rounding the far side of the building, stringing the antenna wire, which was so fine as to be invisible from where he stood. He waited a moment until the walls were between them, then let himself through the gate that led to the laboratory door. It was well that no one noticed the direction from which he approached. He observed that Nikolai was doing his job with speed and efficiency, concealing the strand at knee-height here between bushes, there among small trees. At night it would be quite undetectable. Obviously such work was more to his taste than cleaning animal cages. Dr. Schutz unlocked the laboratory door and let himself in. Just inside, on the floor, he saw Nikolai had already placed the transmitter, an oblong object the size of a shoebox. A small wire led from it up the side of the door jamb and out the top. From there it would run first to the fence somewhere near the entrance. He must be sure Kublitz showed him the off-on switch. There must be no alarm when he entered at midnight. He glanced at the girl's empty cage and at the chimpanzee crouched in the cage next to it. Then he entered the inner laboratory. Georg Wolter was still at work with the microscope, copying figures in orderly tables. Dr. Schutz said quietly, "The girl is hidden. When Kublitz and Nikolai have left, I will bring her back. Tomorrow we will begin the tests. With anthraxis, oral intake first as planned, near the water system." Georg said, "The cultures are ready. The pump? In order." Dr. Schutz went to a desk on the other side of the room and opened a filing cabinet beside it. Methodically began removing the sheets of notes he would need for his final report, the report which would never be seen by either Kublitz or his leader, General Vasilovsky. Thus, when Kublitz arrived, half an hour later, he found a scene of routine activity. With relief, Dr. Schutz saw him deposit on the desk the bulky loose-leaf binder containing the early reports, all of the Group 17 reports, all of his own private data. "Remember the classification," Kublitz said again, and on the few previous occasions when he had visited the inner laboratory, he held a handkerchief to his nose and looked with nervous distaste at the glass cabinets along the walls where the cultures were kept. "I am not likely to forget it," said Dr. Schutz. "You will recall that I wrote them myself." Still, rather ostentatiously, he picked up the file, placed it in a drawer in the steel cabinet, and locked the drawer. At that moment, Nikolai entered. He spoke to Kublitz in Russian. There followed a brief dialogue which Dr. Schutz could not understand. Kublitz explained in English. "The antenna is completed and the transmitter turned on. It will emit a signal only if someone disturbs the wire. If you and Walter will follow, Nikolai will show you the disconnect switch so that you may enter and leave the laboratory without sounding the alarm." 10 minutes later, Kublitz and Nikolai, having sprayed themselves generously with disinfectant, walked off through the drizzle in the direction of the villa. Georg and Dr. Schultz returned to their work in the laboratory. When they were inside, Dr. Schutz said to Georg, "As you see, it has all worked out quite simply. I will now get the girl and return her to the cage." As he went through the gate in the wire fences, he was careful to turn the transmitter switch to off. It was turning dusk as he walked into the woods. And that was the end of chapter 21.